Welcome to the Sciammas Podcast, where we talk to the most experienced people in B2B to find answers to one simple question. How can you become and remain essential to your strategic customers? Tune in as our guests reveal what it takes to become the supplier they cannot afford to lose. Learn how to level up your account management strategies to promptly deliver speed, convenience, and success to each customer. Let's jump into the discussion right now.
Welcome back to part two of our executive conversation series with Jacques Sciammas, president of Selling to Executives. In our previous episode, we talked about some of the current macro issues that are going on in the marketplace. And we talked a little bit about how executives are responding and reacting to uncertainty and their expectations. We also zoomed in on the C-suite itself and how it's evolving with new roles gaining influence, new responsibilities coming about, the power centers shifting, and what that means for strategic sellers that are navigating some of these complex buying teams. So today, we're going to shift our focus to unpack how executives define value and what truly drives decision-making at the C-level. And with that, Jacques, I'd like to bring you back into segment two. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the executive conversation.
Thank you, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always fun and insightful to have these discussions. So I look forward to it.
Thanks again. Well, let's kick off because I think, you covered a lot of great ground in that first segment, Jacques, and I was reflecting back to some of the big rock elements of advice that you were sharing with our audience. So now if we were to pivot and we think now about how not only executives think, what's important to them, our teams have done due diligence and discovery about who they are, and we talk about where to engage and what to engage on. When do executives typically get involved in the buying process, let's say? And I think as a former CFO, COO, when you think about it across the organization, when do executives typically get involved in the buying cycle?
So we will get involved when we talk about big deals. So every company, as you probably know, has limits of approval authority. So people can sign up to a certain amount, whether it's capital or operating expense, whether it's planned or unplanned. Different levels of authority in terms of amounts that are being proposed. And we'll get involved when you talk about the large deals, always on the early side and the end. So the beginning and the end. On the early side, on the beginning, because we want to basically agree that this makes sense for people to work on, along with the vendor suppliers, that it fits our strategic initiatives. So kind of it's aligned on the front and also the budget for it if needed. On the back end, obviously, when a lot of the hard work has been done on the selection of vendor and final approval. So those are the two that are really important in terms of where we get involved. Now, of course, during that sales cycle in the middle, we get some intermittent reports, and anything that is relevant will be advised or be involved in. So, but beginning and end is a must. And I guess maybe the point here is for the suppliers and vendors, they should make sure they get to us early.
I was thinking about something as you were providing that response, and I'll frame it as, well, as you mentioned, first of all, as an executive in the decision-making process, does this align with our strategic imperatives or priorities or outcomes that we're trying to focus on, or does it help us overcome a barrier or challenge? And then secondly, how does your being able to demonstrate, how does your solution actually do that? How does it enable or align to those outcomes? And then the third piece that I'm hearing more and more about, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this, is how important is it to be able to come forward and show you where we've done it before with other clients, either in your industry or other industries, but solving for similar priorities or outcomes. So the use case, the business case, how much of that weighs heavily on your influence to say yes, especially in the beginning?
I think that's extremely valuable. So, what does it do when you have some use cases or referrals of the same type of proposal or solution, ideally in our same industry, ideally in our same size, ideally in our same region? Of course, the closer the match is, the better. But references and use cases are critical and super important because what does it do? It basically says that some other C-suite executives, some logical, smart people have made the decision to invest in that. So they've done a lot of their due diligence. They've done a lot of research. They've tested it. And it works. Hopefully, you're talking to us about it because it's positive.
Yeah, yeah.
And basically, it reduces the risk level. It basically says that, hey, others have done it and it works. That's a lot easier to sell to the board than when you say, hey, it's great to be first mover, but we can't tell you what the risk is. We can't tell you if it's going to work. We don't know if we're going to lose our money. We don't know if we're going to lose our customers. We don't know if we're going to lose our reputation. That is a much bigger risk than when we talk about, well, it's been done before and it works. Almost think of yourself as, you're going to fix something in your house. The plumbing is broken. You want somebody who's done it successfully, and your neighbor says, hey, great job, and it works. And, obviously it's nice to know that the cost is within reason, but the value is huge. No different. We want referrals. It's big plus in the front end and in the back end, by the way, not just up front.
There's one more piece to this because I'm glad what you said about selling to the board. So one of the kind of the mental maps that I've heard many executives think about, me included, is first of all, do you understand our priorities, our opportunities? Second, how does your solution address it? We talked about that. And then third, where have you done it before? So those use cases, those referrals, where in the practical application, we then know what those lessons learned are and the value and impact that it's having. But then it's the fourth kind of step in the process, the case for change. And when you think about, let's say, the conversation you need to have to and with your board, what is your expectation of your vendor or supplier to influence or even be a part of that case for change? To what degree would you ask them to help provide the influence needed to convince the board?
So one thing that they should do, and probably we all know that, but it goes back to, what is the story? Tell me the story of your proposal. This is not about products and bells and whistles and technical jargon. This is about what's the story, what's the business impact, what's the outcome. And you want to tell it to me in simple business terms. So for two reasons. One, I'll understand it. And two, I'll be able to repeat it and communicate it to the board. If I don't get the whole understanding when I be presenting to the board, I probably will not do your proposal justice. So you want to basically assume that you want somebody who's just a business person, not a finance person, not an IT person, not a technology, just a person who can communicate the story of your proposal and the business impact and the value. So that's one. The second thing is, keep in mind that the board are just normal people. They're not engineers. I mean, they're all kinds they're business people, usually successful business people, but they basically are common sense people. So think of it, what are the questions that come up when you present that to the board? We talked about use cases. It's good to tell me all the good, but tell me the bad too. Because the beauty about use cases, if somebody had a problem with an implementation or a solution, it's good for me to know it, but it's good for me to know that you resolved it, that they paid the price and I'm getting the benefit. So share with me the pluses and the minuses, because that way I'll also trust you more. So repeatability, simple terms, and the pluses and the minuses and how they got it resolved. So I'm not impacted.
That is such a powerful insight. I love that. We're thinking about kind of inside your head and the decision-making process that you and other executives use. What's the relationship, let's say, between rational decisions and facts versus so-called gut decisions? So you've got the data, the facts, the figures, and then I've got to go with my gut. What's the relationship like for you in that regard as part
A
of
lot of
decision making?
the facts, decisions, data, the data and facts, all these are very useful because they are very logical justification. The gut is based on our experience and a little bit of our sentiment, our feeling. And both of them play the role when you decide because the gut and the judgment and the experience, that's worth a lot. Maybe you can't define it in terms of numbers, but in terms of value, it's a lot. And the data is important because it justifies some facts and it just solidifies what maybe your gut feeling is. So we use both. We can't say that, oh, these are the data and that's all. We don't need management to decide. Then they don't need us. They just go with the data and put it in ChatGPT and get an answer.
I think I know the answer to this next question, which is, in fact, I'm going to come back to it because I'm going to ask you in a minute, how do you truly, you mentioned value, how do you truly define value? But before I ask that question, when you think of the common mistakes that sellers or their, let's say, sales teams make when approaching you and other executives, what are the fundamental or common mistakes that they make?
I'd say the two most common is lack of proper research and preparation. And I don't mean that they haven't prepared. I mean, they haven't prepared for us, the C-suite. That's one, and that's cited by most CEOs in Forrester surveys and other surveys. Most of them say, yeah, they're not prepared. 80% of them, they're not prepared for us in the meetings that they've had. So that's just factual that there's so much good preparation to do. No excuse. And that's really key. Preparation you got to do. When you look at the second mistake is you don't want to treat one size fits all. So if you're talking to a CFO, it's a different conversation than if you're talking to a CIO or a CTO or a CMO. You have to have the right conversation in the right language of that executive. Okay, it's not a PowerPoint presentation. Pass it on, because I'm going to think, what's in it for me? So those are the two things that I think they're most, unfortunately, guilty of: not preparing enough and presenting a solution that they think is the same for everybody in terms of value and in terms of my decision-making process.
That solution may not necessarily align back to what you were saying earlier, the objective or the priority or outcome you're looking to achieve, which then, of course, let's talk about value. So when you think about value, what does that look like for you? How do you define it, really?
Well, when I chaired the capital committee, we looked at value from the ecosystem of our company, which means what are we responsible for? We're responsible for our revenue growth, our profitability, our margin, anything that's financial oriented, P&L, balance sheet, all that stuff we're responsible for. That's a given. Shareholders expect that. Analysts expect that. So we have to be accountable. But we also have to think about our customers, because we're serving our customers. What's good for our customers? Where's the value to our customers? And then what's the value to our employees? Because, they talk about our employees are our biggest asset and most important asset. It's very true. You have So where is the value to our employees? Does it make their work easier? Does it make them happier? All that stuff. When I was at Schwab, we did a project that basically was called Unstuffing the Branches. Unstuffing the branches, we had about 500 branches across the US. And the project was really basically the branch personnel. They were doing mostly 70% of their time was administrative and routine work, which they didn't like it. And it was expensive because it was real people who were doing the work that could have been automated or it could have been outsourced, or it could have gone to call centers. And you didn't need people who are registered brokers, for example, to do that. So we did that project, but it basically called Unstuffing the Branches over a year and a half. And we took all 80% of the work that they didn't like and didn't need to do, and they basically put it into call center and into, basically a portal. And as a result, they were happier and they were able to spend their time on business development and getting assets and accounts. And the company just shot up in terms of revenue. You could probably see it in terms of growth, what happened during that time period, what happened to the stock price, what happened to customer satisfaction, and what happened to all of the financial components that I mentioned. So think of it, what's in it for the customers, what's in it for the employees, what's in it in terms of the financials, and also don't forget the stuff I do not control. What do I mean by that? Compliance, risk, security, regulation, all that stuff I have to comply with. I have to address. I can't let it just go by. So if you have something for me, what does it do to any of these? What does it do to those? What does it do to my P&L, my balance sheet? What does it do to my people? What does it do to my customers? And what does it do for me too?
Yeah, indeed. What I love about that example you just shared is that, the obvious impact to customers, as you described, the financial piece, but also the employee satisfaction piece, because you've solved for a higher level of employee productivity, employee satisfaction, job growth, value, and therefore that ultimately has a downstream impact on employee retention and satisfaction. So I love that example. In the first segment, we talked about times of uncertainty. We didn't talk about disruption per se, but those things are very much connected tissue, as you know, Jacques. And I was thinking about it in the context of there is so much disruption happening today because of three things. One is, and of course there are many more, but the three that I most commonly talk about is the proliferation of technology, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, the educated buyer and expectations of customers continuously shifting, moving up and over as the sands shift under their feet. And then the third is really the introduction of agile competitors that can leapfrog legacy competitors into the marketplace without all of the baggage or the infrastructure or CapEx that agile competitors can now leapfrog into new market opportunities and be disruptors. So when you think of it from an executive point of view and how technology is enabling you to do things differently in the proliferation of technology, how you meet customer demands and expectations that are shifting as we just talked about, and then how do you mitigate risk to keep those agile competitors from encroaching on your business? When you think of it from the executive's lens, we have to balance all of these things because they're real. These are real headwinds of disruption. How are you? What's your thought process on that? And most importantly, what should your vendors or suppliers be thinking about when they're meeting with you in that context?
As you mentioned, Gordon, there are a lot of variables that are moving. So
Yeah.
technology is moving at an exponential rate. That's a given. The C-suite is evolving and is moving and is changing. We talked about that. And then you got these unknowns, as you point out, that are really disrupting a lot of other things. And the one thing, all these challenges of the C-suite, not just the vendors and the suppliers. They're challenges for us too. So the main thing here from the vendor supplier perspective is to basically look at, put yourself in my mind, in my shoes, and think, let's start from scratch. What's the first thing I want to do? I want to lower the risk level of disrupting negatively my business. Preservation of capital, preservation of my customers, preservation of my revenue, preservation of my brand. That is sacred. I want that first. And then let me talk about what can I do to grow it. So think all these variables moving. What do you have for me that's going to help me basically be more comfortable with that decision so that I don't worry that I made a decision that had cost my business a lot. Okay. And then what else do you have for me that's going to make it better? Because those variables are going to keep moving. Now, maybe one will move faster than the other, but we can't worry about, let's find out how much it will move. Let's try to find out what you can do for me now. Okay. Because also, if you look at the C-suite, the tenure of a lot of these CXOs has come down, and I want to be around when I see the benefit. Just
That's
a
so
minor
true.
point for me.
Yeah, that is so true. Jacques, as we're coming kind of full circle on this segment, part 2 of 3, what other sage advice would you have in the context of how you think as an executive and your peers as well in the decision-making process? And what advice would you give to our audience relative to now how they think differently, how they engage with you and others differently, and how they align to what's most important for you and your organization?
I would say, as you probably know, start with the client. Start with my mind. Start with my goal. Start with what I need to do, whether it's to cut down on a problem I have or to address a challenge or address a goal I have, based on my strategic priorities, which you can find out easily. So start with that and work your way into whatever you're proposing, if that's applicable and relevant. So lead to your proposal, not with your proposal. Quite often, salespeople, they're living and breathing their products and technology and their proposal, that it's natural for them to talk about that and talk about that a lot. Now, forget about that. I don't think that way. I don't think I am going to look at what this vendor has and what's good for me. I'm going to look at what I have and what I need to do. So you have to think that way in order to be on the side of the executive and the executive be on your side.
Jacques, this has been really, really insightful. I think if I were to just kind of summarize, I think it starts first with understanding your business better, the priorities, the decision-making process, how you think, and then how are we relevant to it, our solution, and how does it address directly or indirectly the outcomes you're trying to achieve, the priorities that you're focused on, and the headwinds that you're facing, especially as we talked earlier about uncertainty and disruption. And then third, tell the story through a use case of where you've done it elsewhere, either in my region, my industry, even maybe other parts of my organization where an implementation was successful. But also don't tell me what's gone well with that, but also what were the challenges or aspects that didn't go well. So I have a full appreciation and empathy going in to position this with my board for the case for change or to make that investment with the full picture. Don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what I need to hear. So I think understanding kind of that construct of how you decide, how you think, how your peers in the organization respond, I think that was all very, very insightful and incredibly useful for our audience, I'm sure. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So that brings us full circle on part 2 of our series where we explored, as we just said, what it takes to connect, to executive decision makers at the C-suite and within their functions, from understanding how they think to shaping conversations that are going to truly drive action and value. And so now, in our third and final episode, we're going to talk about the next layer down. How do we prepare? What are the steps required to make the most of your time for that executive so that they not only see value in you, but with empathy, you understand their business and they're now pulling you closer. And that starts with the research that you talked about earlier, Jacques, to messaging to understand what success looks like through their eyes, in their language. So until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in segment 3.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jacques. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope today's wisdom will lead you down the path of experiencing success in your profession. Remember, the key to successful strategic account management is discovering where your customer wants to go and helping them get there. Subscribe to our podcasts at strategicaccounts.org. We hope you will leave a positive rating and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. If there's something we can do to improve our podcasts, please let us know. That's all for today. See you on the next one.